Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. Or at least my copy says Sasquatch. Anyway, Chapter 4, Sifting the Evidence. Let's get started. Missing remains. All skeptics and scientists are united on one point. They would be convinced that the Sasquatch actually exists if they saw a dead body, or at least a significant part of one, such as a skull or several bones. Before moving on to look at the evidence that does exist, it would be worth spending a bit of time looking at the evidence that does not exist. Why is there no Sasquatch body? One problem that all researchers have to face is that no Sasquatch bodies have ever been found. It could be said that this is because there is no such thing as a Sasquatch, but that would be false logic. There are other possible explanations as well. If we assume that the Sasquatch exists as a real animal, then we must also agree that individuals must die from time to time and leave their bodies. However, we know that the Sasquatch is a relatively intelligent creature. It certainly has the edge in brain power over other large examples of North American wildlife, such as cougar or bear. It may even prove to be more intelligent than the gorilla and other large apes. Some researchers believe that it is. It is not impossible, therefore, that the Sasquatch do not much care for the thought of the dead body of a family member being devoured by wolves or cougar, and so take steps to hide it from such scavengers. Perhaps they bury the body, perhaps they hide it. Either way, the body would not only be hidden from wolves, but also from humans. If this sounds a bit far-fetched, it is worth bearing in mind that archaeological evidence shows that respect for the dead began very early in human evolution. Neanderthal people certainly buried their dead, and there is some evidence that burials might have also taken place among the much more primitive Homo erectus species. An alternative explanation is that the Sasquatch might seek shelter when it felt ill. Thus, a sick or injured Sasquatch would crawl off into a dense patch of undergrowth to be safe from cougar or wolves. If that Sasquatch were to die rather than recover, its body would be left lying where humans would be unlikely to find it. A third explanation looks to the wolves, cougars, bears, and other carnivores that share the range of the Sasquatch. When a creature as big as a Sasquatch dies, the suddenly available meat would make a tasty and nutritious meal for a good number of creatures. Given that these predators are known to take carrion and have an exceptionally fine sense of smell, they could be relied upon to find a Sasquatch body that was left lying about in the open. Within a matter of a few days, perhaps even a few hours, the carcass would be picked clean. For precisely this reason, professional hunters who spend a lot of time out in the wilderness areas very rarely come across the dead body of a bear, an elk, or a deer. The scavengers would, however, leave at least some bones behind. These would be scattered over a wide area, but skulls and thigh bones in particular might be expected to survive the attentions of wolves and then lie around in a conspicuous position for a passing human to spot. In other places and habitats, this is undoubtedly the case, but not in the mountainous forests of the Pacific seaboard. These forests have a naturally very acidic soil, which is usually overlaid with equally acidic coniferous leaf litter and assorted debris. Bones are highly susceptible to the leaching effects of acid. Any bone left lying on the surface of the ground would within a few days suffer from a loss of calcium and other minerals. It would become liable to fracture if touched by a passing animal, and could crumble away to dust in a surprisingly short time. In conclusion, it is hardly surprising that no Sasquatch body has been found. What is more surprising is that anybody could think that one might be. Pulling the trigger. But if no Sasquatch that has died from natural causes has been found, what about the possibility that a Sasquatch might be shot by a hunter? This has not yet happened. In part, this is because relatively few people who have encountered a Sasquatch had a gun on them at the time. Out of those that carried a gun, few saw the creature long enough to get a clear shot. Some people have been in a position to shoot a Sasquatch, but a high proportion say that they deliberately chose not to do so because they felt that shooting one would be more akin to murder than hunting. In a very small number of reports, a person has shot at a Sasquatch in conditions where a hit was likely, and yet there was still no body. If the Sasquatch that was shot at was a real animal, this requires some explanation. Experiences with bears of a similar bulk to that claimed for a Sasquatch would indicate that even a mortally wounded animal can cover a fair distance between being shot and actually dying. Sasquatch that have been shot at have been reported to cry out and then run off. That would be perfectly natural, as for the human's decision not to follow a large, wounded and potentially very aggressive animal into thick cover. There are also instances where the reaction of a Sasquatch to being shot was entirely unnatural. On the evening of February 6, 1974, a lady living in a rural house near Uniontown, Pennsylvania, heard her dogs barking as if an intruder was approaching. She looked outside to see a hairy, human-like figure in her yard, which seemed to be about 7 feet tall. She picked up a shotgun, opened her door, and stepped out onto the porch to get a better look. When she switched on the yard light, the figure turned towards her, raised its arms over its head, and started walking towards her. Thinking she was about to be attacked, the woman lifted her shotgun and blasted the creature at point-blank range. There was a sudden flash of light and a loud bang, whereupon the creature vanished into thin air. Such odd reports would explain why a body is not found, but they would also tend to rule out the Sasquatch as a real creature. We shall be looking for an explanation that draws together all the disparate elements of the Sasquatch enigma in the next chapter. For now, it is enough to note that the lack of a body does not necessarily mean the lack of a real creature. The best examples of evidence for the existence of the Sasquatch are the thousands of footprints that have been found in the forests where it is said to live. Some of these are isolated footprints in patches of mud, but others come from trackways that run over considerable distances. One track, found in August 1967, ran along a dirt road in British Columbia for over half a mile and consisted of about 1,000 footprints. Many hundreds of these tracks have been photographed or preserved as plaster casts, so it is possible to use them to determine whether newly found footprints are consistent with Sasquatch sightings. Before the days of taking animals with radio collars to record their movements, one of the prime methods used by naturalists to study large mammals in the wild was to use the tracks they left behind. It can be surprisingly difficult to locate a wild mammal if it does not want to be found. In 2004, a professional wildlife camera crew was sent by the BBC into the western Himalayas to film snow leopards. They spent over 5 months in the mountains, but came back with only about 45 seconds of footage good enough to broadcast. The footprints left behind, however, were much easier to locate and to study. From studying the footprints of animals, it is possible to deduce how many of them are living in a particular area, how large they are, and very often what sex they are. The habits of the creatures in general can be worked out from the places in which the footprints are found. Individual actions such as drinking, feeding, or sleeping can be seen in the footprints. When dealing with larger animals, it is possible to work out the habits and accustomed actions of individuals, even to the extent of ascribing individual characters and names to them. Colonel Jim Corbett was a noted big game hunter before the Second World War. He was frequently sent for by the British authorities in India as a tiger or leopard turned man-eater, such things being more usual when the numbers of those carnivores were much greater than today. He invariably began his hunt by studying the pug marks of the suspected man-eater, as well as those of any other tigers in the area. Only after having identified the particular man-eater from its pug marks would he begin the hunt, ignoring the other carnivores of the area. Very often, he never saw the man-eater until he came to shoot it, having spent the previous weeks getting to know it from its tracks alone. Many other hunters and naturalists have likewise been able to identify and study animals. Faking it. It must at first be admitted that some of the Sasquatch footprints that have been reported are probably fakes. Skeptics would hold that all of the prints are hoaxes, and even the most dedicated Sasquatch believer will accept that some evidence is fraudulent. Writing in 1989, Grover Krantz estimated that up to half of all the supposed Sasquatch footprints that were reported were either fakes or else they looked like fakes. Except in cases where the fraudsters have confessed or been unmasked, it is almost impossible to know which prints are real and which are not. A knowledge of animal behavior can, however, be used to dismiss obvious fakes. When a wild animal leaves a track, it is not a simple matter of a foot being pushed down into soil, mud, or snow to leave a print. The creature that leaves the tracks is moving, and the footprints show the traces of this. Toes may dig in to get a grip when going uphill, or splay out on mud. If the creature changes direction, the foot will twist, and so distort the print it leaves behind. Nor is the foot a solid object. Even the foot of a wild Sasquatch, with pads of hardened skin on the soles of its feet, is a relatively soft object. It will fold around stones and other hard objects so that a footprint may well have a stone sticking up inside it. Most fakes are made by people using wooden plates carved to the size and shape of a Sasquatch footprint. These are then tied on to the feet, and the faker walks around, leaving behind impressive-looking tracks. Such crude fakes are easily identified. The footprints left by the wooden feet show no signs of movement. Each print is identical to the last. Moreover, the depth of the footprint will reveal the fact that the creator weighed much the same as a human, whereas the Sasquatch has a far greater weight. Strapping on a heavy backpack will increase the depth of the footprint, but it will make it almost impossible for the faker to move about except on level, firm ground. The famous hoaxer Ray Wallace used this method of making false Sasquatch tracks. He would strap on his wooden feet and go striding about on and beside trails that he knew to be heavily used by urban vacationers who would have a limited knowledge of wild animal tracks. His efforts led to a large number of reports being made, and they often led to newspaper stories, but they were usually quickly revealed for what they were once a researcher got to see them at first hand. A more sophisticated method of faking Bigfoot tracks emerged in the later 1980s. A number of tracks and footprints began to be found which, although obviously not created by wooden feet, were suspect. They had been made by a soft, foot-like object, but while they showed some signs of dynamic interaction between the foot and the ground, they did not show the foot or the toes moving or flexing in any way. Researchers were suspicious but puzzled. It was Donald Baird of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History who worked out how they had probably been produced. Baird was a paleontologist who specialized in latex and rubber molds, and he brought those skills to bear on the problem. The starting point is the need for molds, which can be produced by carving wood to the shape of a pair of Sasquatch feet. These molds can then be carefully filled with alternating layers of silicone rubber and cheesecloth to give the desired mix of strength and flexibility. Once the compound reaches a thickness of about an inch, the work of laying down a false track can begin. First, a site needs to be found where the surface is firmer rather than soft. The person laying the fake trail needs to cover his or her own shoes in bags containing padding so that they will not leave a track. The first print should be made by putting the fake foot onto the ground and then stamping it down by repeatedly hitting a wooden pad inside the foot with a hammer. By using a small pad, different parts of the foot can be struck with different amounts of force, so imitating a living foot that might exert more thrust on the heel than on the midsection. With practice, this process can be used to leave a track that gives a more realistic appearance than one made using a cruder method. The soft latex will ensure that stones are left standing proud of the main print, while differential hammering will give an illusion of foot movement. Such a method can create surprisingly realistic prints, but even so it cannot mimic a muscled foot that changes its shape or grip during a step. Nor is it much good on softer ground. Once researchers knew how the fake could be done, they could spot the frauds more easily. What seemed to be one such trail was found in January 1991, near Mill Creek, Washington State. It was investigated by Oregon-based researcher James Hooken, who, at first sight, the actual footprints seemed genuine enough. It was the configuration of the track that raised suspicions. The track began high on a snow-covered hill, ran down through woods to cross a field where winter wheat was starting to sprout, crossed a road, headed for a stream, and then cut back to the road where the footprints ended. The fact that the trail ended at a road was suspicious in itself. Moreover, for much of their length, the footprints showed a clear tendency for the feet to be splayed, a human characteristic. Where the tracks crossed the fence, the prints were set exactly where a biped of human height would put them, though the size of the prints indicated that they had been made by a Sasquatch over 7 feet tall. Finally, one footprint was curiously deformed and slashed. Careful analysis showed that the mark had been made by the foot toppling sideways and leaving a flat depression. The conclusion was that the feet were rubber or silicone fakes that had been mounted on flat-sided blocks, probably of wood, and then strapped onto the feet of a human who was about 5 feet 9 inches tall. The real thing? Frauds apart, there are many thousands of footprints, some of them in clearly defined tracks, that are accepted by researchers as being genuine. It is these that should be studied to see what they reveal about the creature that made them. All that can be done is to concentrate on those that are reported by the more reliable witnesses, who did not seek profit from their findings, and then draw conclusions from the mass of data. The size and shape of the prints varies greatly. The press gave the Sasquatch the name Bigfoot for the purposes of headline writing, because the footprints discovered by Jerry Crew were so large. Most of the Sasquatch footprints that have been discovered since that time have also been large. Lengths of 15 inches and widths of 6 inches are not at all unusual. But size is not the only distinguishing feature. Sasquatch footprints are a different shape to those of humans and show signs of differences in foot structure as well. The foot of a Sasquatch is wider in proportion to its length than is the human foot. Its heel and toes are more elongated than in a human foot. While the toes are sometimes splayed out, at other times they appear to have been held curved up close to the ball of the foot. The impression received from the prints is that the toes are long and strongly muscled. In addition, Sasquatch feet usually leave an impression that is flat across the whole sole, because unlike the human foot, there is no arch. Even a human with fallen arches could not leave a print like that of a Sasquatch. There are also clear differences in the way the foot bears the weight of the walker. A human foot carries the weight of the body on the heel as the foot is put down, then on the ball just behind the big toe as the body moves on. The print left by a human walking in a straight line will be deeper at the heel and the ball than elsewhere. As the foot lifts off, it will push back at the ball, often scooping a disc of soil out of the print. Humans have adapted to this method of walking in order to save energy at the expense of grip. Given that humans evolved on the East African plains, the workings of the human foot make perfect sense. Early humans needed to be able to walk considerable distances with relatively little effort while searching for food. The grassy plains provided firm, fairly smooth surfaces on which to walk. The Sasquatch seem to have adapted to a different sort of walking. Their footprints often show what is known as mid-tarsal break. This appears as a clear ridging of the soil or mud about halfway along the foot in a footprint. It is caused by the foot bending at this point as the weight of the animal is transferred to the front of the foot. Human footprints do not show this feature because the human foot simply cannot bend at this point, which is just in front of the ankle. The mid-tarsal bones are fused solid in the human foot. In some Sasquatch footprints, only the part of the foot in front of the mid-tarsal break leaves an impression. Again, this is impossible for a human foot. Built for grip. Another feature of the Sasquatch foot that is seen in the footprints is the long heel. Where the movement of the foot can be deduced from the tracks, it seems that the back end of the heel is some considerable distance behind the shin. This would indicate that the Achilles tendon, which connects the muscles of the shin to the back of the heel, is further back from the hinge of the ankle than it is in humans. The effect of this arrangement would be to increase the leverage exerted by the muscles on the rear part of the foot, exactly what would be needed to apply increased force to a foot that bends halfway along its length. The stride length of Sasquatch tracks varies widely, presumably due to the speed at which the creature was moving. A creature on a slow stroll will leave footprints closer together than one that is running fast. Where a Sasquatch seems to have been moving in no great hurry, it will typically leave a track with a step length of about 4 feet. In addition, each of the footprints is almost behind the other, with all of them pointing in the direction of travel. Again, this is different from a human track, where the left and right feet are splayed out on either side of an imaginary line, with the right feet pointing slightly to the right and the left feet slightly to the left. Putting all of this together gives a fairly clear picture of the type of animal that left the prints. Clearly, the creature is bipedal, because the marks of its hands or front feet are reported only when the creature was scrambling up or down a steep slope. Not only that, but the flexing of the foot would give the walker an increased ability to grip the ground. In humans, the stiff foot makes the toes the key feature of the push-off part of a stride. Having a flexible foot, as indicated by the Sasquatch footprints, transfers the push-off pressure to the front half of the foot and the shin muscles. The toes are thus able to splay out or curl up depending on the surface being negotiated. Such a flexible foot also increases the area in contact with the ground at each stage of the step. This would tend to even out the depth of the footprint, a feature that characterizes Sasquatch tracks. It also gives a lower pressure load, important for a beast that may weigh up to 1,000 pounds. A stride of around 4 feet, a foot about 16 inches long, and a mid-torso break would indicate a height of around 7 feet. This is, indeed, the sort of height reported for Sasquatches by witnesses. Moreover, the mid-torso break would give the Sasquatch a gait that is quite different from that of humans. Humans bob up and down as they walk because of their stiff feet, but Sasquatches would not show such an obvious vertical movement as they walk. Again, this is a feature that has been noted by witnesses who have seen a Sasquatch walking. Hard surface. Another feature of the Sasquatch stride, as reported by witnesses, is that the knee does not lock so that the leg is straight. This is known as a compliant gait. Humans will sometimes adopt this way of walking for short periods of time, usually as a reaction to a very hard surface or to carrying a heavy weight. Given the great size of the Sasquatch, the habitual use of a compliant gait is probably due to its weight. All of this evidence suggests that the anatomy of the Sasquatch foot is closer to that of the great apes. Gorillas, chimpanzees, and other apes use their long toes and the front part of the foot to grip branches as they climb, or to hold food objects as they feed. The big toe sticks out sideways like a thumb to aid this grip function. It would seem that the Sasquatch big toe moved to face forward as it became bipedal, but that the toes and the front of the foot retained the ability to grip. This might be a result of the animal living in a mountainous forested region. The ground in such areas is often broken and uneven, with frequent bumps and dips. The Sasquatch would need to deal with all of this while remaining able to negotiate steep slopes with ease. The apparent structure of the Sasquatch foot, as revealed in its prints, would be more suited to this purpose than the human foot. Many researchers have noticed that some Sasquatch tracks seem to have been made by feet identical to those that made other tracks in a similar area. This might indicate that a single creature was making the prints. This phenomenon is not usually used as evidence that the Sasquatch is a real creature, for the simple reason that skeptics can argue that it was not the same Sasquatch but the same hoaxer. Washed away by rain. But there is one interesting example that relates to the Patterson film. Roger Patterson went back to the area where he shot his film because of reports of new Bigfoot tracks left by a family group. The footprints seemed to be those of one large individual, one that was slightly smaller, and a third that was significantly smaller. At the time, the tracks were seen as being made by a male, a female, and their offspring. These prints were washed away by rain before Patterson arrived on the scene. He had not been in a position to fake them, or even to seal them and so produce a false foot based on them. It was not until some years later that somebody thought to compare the footprints cast at the site of the Patterson film with those that had later been found in the same area. The new casts from the Patterson site turned out to match one of the earlier sets of footprints almost exactly. This again seemed to indicate that the Patterson film was of a genuine Sasquatch. As Patterson had not seen the earlier footprints, it was unlikely that he could have faked footprints to match them. What was surprising was that it was not the slightly smaller female set that matched, but the larger male set. Given that the creature filmed by Patterson is quite clearly a female, this must mean that the female group was not a mated pair with their offspring, but an adult female accompanied by an almost adult Sasquatch and another that was much younger. It is not only footprints and tracks that form evidence for the Sasquatch. Other marks left behind by what seem to be Sasquatch have been discovered and analyzed. All fingers and thumbs. In 1962, a passing Sasquatch leaned against a house near Fort Bragg, California, and left its handprint behind. The outline of the print was traced by the house owner, who said that no internal features such as knuckle joints could be made out. It was 11 inches long, and most of this length was taken up by the wide, flat palm. The fingers were relatively short and stubby, and of almost equal length, while the thumb was nearer to the fingers than the wrist, and was likewise stubby. In 1980, Bob Titmus was following a Sasquatch track when he reached a spot where the creature had climbed a steep, muddy bank. On top of the bank was a handprint that lay exactly where a tall, human-like creature would have put its hand to help pull itself up. A plaster cast was taken. The key feature of the thumbprint is that it is facing in the same direction as the fingers. If you hold out your own hand and look at the digits, you will see that your thumb faces in towards the palm, while the fingers are all facing downwards. Known as the opposable thumb, this is a distinctive human feature that no other ape has. The opposable thumb makes possible what is known as the precision grip used when you hold a pencil or a screwdriver, for instance. It allows a human to manipulate small objects with great dexterity, care, and precision. Without it, a human hand would only be capable of what is termed the power grip, the type of grip used when wielding a hammer or an axe. This is fine for exerting brute force, but it does not allow for either delicacy or precision. It would seem from Titmus's handprint that the Sasquatch cannot manage a precision grip. In 1986, Paul Freeman found and cast another handprint, this time produced by a Sasquatch that had been apparently crouching down to drink. It confirmed that the thumb was incapable of the precision grip, but it seemed to give the additional information that the index finger was almost incapable of moving independently of other fingers. This is a feature found in most great apes, such as gorillas and orangutans, but not in humans. The Skookum Cast. One of the most impressive tracks left by a Sasquatch, but also one of the most controversial, is the so-called Skookum Cast. As with the Patterson film, the Skookum cast has come in for a great deal of analysis, not only by those prepared to accept the reality of Sasquatch, but also by those who remain skeptical. Again, as with the Patterson film, much of the criticism has come from the fact that the cast was found by people who were expressly going out looking for evidence of Bigfoot activity. Skeptics thought that this made hoaxes or misidentification more likely, while others pointed out that only those looking for Bigfoot signs would have noticed the thing in the first place. The story began in September 2000 when the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization organized a 10-man expedition into the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. The BFRO is one of the most respected outfits in the business of coordinating research into the Bigfoot/Sasquatch enigma. They bring together reports and eyewitness accounts, scientific analysis, and discussion groups, and their website contains a wealth of information and ongoing blogs. Of relevance to the Skookum cast episode is the fact that the BFRO organized field trips to the remote regions in which the Sasquatch are said to live. There they carry out a variety of experiments and teach novice researchers the tricks of the trade, showing them what to look for and how to record any finds or sightings. On this particular trip, the BFRO team explored the wilderness looking for footprints and other signs of Sasquatch. Using loudspeakers, they also played a recording of a call thought to have been made by a Sasquatch, in the hope that it would provoke a response. The team also put out baits of fruit on sites next to soft soil. It was hoped that a Sasquatch might be attracted by the fruit and in collecting it, leave tracks behind. At first, not much happened. A call that might have been a Sasquatch was heard, and some large but poor quality footprints were seen. Then, on September 22nd, two of the team went out to inspect the fruit baits. One of the baits had been taken. The fruit had been picked up and most of it had been eaten. A few pieces of debris showed the marks of broad, flat teeth. What at first puzzled Derek Randalls and Richard Knoll was that there were no footprints in the muddy ground where the fruit had been placed. Then they spotted an odd series of marks in the soft soil around the muddy patch. Looking at the marks more closely, they thought that some large animal had laid down there. Randalls and Knoll went off to get Leroy fish and other team members. Returning to the site, they all studied the impression on the soft soil. One of them noticed what seemed to be a heel imprint. Another saw what looked like an arm imprint. It was decided to cast the impression in plaster, even though this eventually consumed 200 pounds of the stuff. The final cast measured 5 feet by 3 and was carefully shipped out to Seattle, where a team of scientists willing to look into Sasquatch evidence was called together. This team included Grover Krantz and Jeff Meldrum, plus wildlife biologist Dr. John Bindernagel and African game specialist Dr. Ron Brown. The team carefully cleaned up the cast by removing soil that had stuck to it. Any hair caught in the plaster was bagged up for analysis. That hair would, as expected, turn out to be mostly elk, deer, and bear, but there were also numerous strands of hair that could not be identified, but which fitted into the emerging pattern of primate-like features. The cast itself, once clean, showed that a large creature had lain down and left its body impression. It seemed to be the impression of a large human-shaped creature resting on its left side. The marks of the left forearm, left leg, left buttock, and left side of the body were quite clear. The only sign of the right leg was the heel, which had been pushed deep into the soft ground as if to steady the creature. Later on, a closer analysis of the heel imprint showed that it retained the distinct shape of an Achilles tendon and skin ridging, as well as signs that it had been moved at least once. The cast also showed clear marks of hair striations, indicating that the thing that had lain down to create it was covered by thick hair. The most likely explanation seemed to be that a Sasquatch had seen the fruit, but had decided not to walk into the mud to get it. Instead, it had lain down next to the mud and then reached out with its right arm to grab it. News of the find was announced by way of a press release on October 23, 2000. Because Dr. Meldrum had studied the cast, the press release went out from the Idaho State University, which meant that it carried much more weight than if it had come from BFRO. The release was suitably cautious, stating only that the cast constitutes compelling and significant new evidence, rather than claiming that it had definitely been produced by a Sasquatch. The press release drew responses from skeptics who claimed that it was most likely caused by an elk lying down. However, the link to Idaho University meant that several specialists were willing to look at the cast. They generally ruled out elk, deer, or any other large creature. By 2006, the only explanations that could satisfactorily account for the Skookum cast were that either a Sasquatch had created it by lying down to reach the fruit, or that a hoaxer had produced it. Looking for traces. Dramatic as the Skookum cast was, it was not the only trace claimed to have been left behind by Sasquatch. One of the most interesting of these was mentioned in passing by William Rowe in his account of his encounter with a Sasquatch in 1955. After describing the creature and how it behaved, he went on, "I wanted to find out if it lived on vegetation entirely or ate meat as well. So I went down and looked for signs. I found it in 5 different places, and although I examined it thoroughly, could find no hair or shells of bugs or insects, so I believe it was strictly a vegetarian." What Rowe was talking about was scat or droppings, as he realized studying droppings can tell you a lot about the creature that made them. It can reveal roughly how big it was and what sorts of food it had been eating. More detailed analysis may turn up internal parasites that are specific to a particular species or group of species. That said, it is also an inexact science. In the absence of any other clues such as tracks, it is possible to accurately identify droppings only some of the time, and that is for known species. For a cryptid such as the Sasquatch, the problem is even more complex. The key issue is being certain that any droppings that have been collected have come from a Sasquatch. Of course, the best way to identify droppings would be to see the animal make them. A second best way would be to collect droppings from beside a track or resting place. Failing that, more general clues such as size, composition, and shape are considered. Most of the droppings that have been tentatively identified as coming from a Sasquatch have not been found beside a track, but on hard ground, where no tracks or footprints were visible. They were picked up as they did not seem to be from any known animal. This does not necessarily mean that they are from a Sasquatch. They might simply be an atypical bear scat. A few samples of droppings that seem most unlike those of known North American animals have been subjected to various tests. The contents have generally shown that the creature was eating mostly plants, including nuts and seeds, but also some meat. Interestingly, one sample contained the eggs of a parasitic worm that lived only in the guts of apes. It could be proved that other examples did not belong to bear, humans, elk, or other local animals large enough to deposit such a size of dropping, but it was impossible to be any more definite. Hares are another potential source of evidence. Several researchers have collected hairs caught on branches or fences at the site of Sasquatch sightings or beside tracks. Mammal hairs can usually be firmly identified so long as they are collected in good condition and have not suffered too much from weathering, trampling, or other damage. It is sometimes possible to identify the group of animals from which a hare came, even if it is not possible to identify the precise species. The basic problem was stated fairly early on by Ray Pinker, who analyzed hair for the California State College. Asked to analyze some hairs in 1968, Pinker said, "I could not identify these hairs as Sasquatch until I have a sample of authentic Sasquatch hair to match them to." He did, however, go on to state unequivocally that the hairs in question did not come from any known North American animal. Bob Titmus found some hair in 1988 that, when analyzed, was found to be broadly similar to, but distinctly different from human hair. Hair collected in Northern California in 1993 was also unidentified, though it did have some structural similarities to that of a gorilla. Dr. Henner Fahrenbach, a biomedical research scientist, has put together a collection of these unidentified hairs. The idea is to try to produce a consistent profile of characteristics that crop up repeatedly. It is hoped that this might eventually produce evidence that some of the unidentified hairs are coming from the same species of animal, thus establishing that there is a species of mammal living in North America that is not yet identified by science. As yet, not enough good quality samples have been collected and analyzed, but the work goes on. Sasquatch nests. Rather rare discoveries in the forests are what appear to be Sasquatch sleeping nests. When he returned from his claimed kidnapping by a Sasquatch, Albert Ostman mentioned that the creatures had slept on what he called blankets made out of woven fir branches and moss. When recalling the backtracking he had done on the Sasquatch that he had seen, William Rowe said, "I found one place where it had slept for a couple of nights under a tree." Unfortunately, he did not elaborate on what this temporary resting place looked like, nor how he recognized it as a sleeping site. On May 13, 2001, researcher Kathy Moskowitz came across 3 structures in the forests near Sonora, California, that seemed to have been deliberately constructed. They were each built out of natural materials that could have been gathered nearby. Since Sasquatch had been reported in the vicinity, she suspected that they might be nests or sleeping areas. The largest and most complete of the nests was unusual in that it had a roof formed out of a 12-foot tall oak sapling that had been bent over and held down with a large rock. A number of pine branches were then leant against or pushed into the branches of the sapling to form a solid wall of vegetation that would have effectively kept out wind or rain. Finally, the sheltered floor of the nest was padded with leaves, ferns, moss, and other vegetation. Other researchers have found similar structures, as well as piles of pine branches or ferns that might be nests. Most of these structures were found in wooded areas and lay on the ground with no attempt at overhead cover. One apparent nest was found in 1988 inside an abandoned mine entrance. It measured 4 feet by 4 feet 6 inches. The base was made of piled sticks that had been covered over with a layer of dead leaves. On top of this was a thick layer of fresh leaves, moss, ferns, and other vegetation. It gave the appearance of having been used several times over a long period, with the top layer replenished with every use. Other than the examples seen by Rowe and Ostman, there is no direct evidence that these nests were built or used by Sasquatch. Nobody has seen a Sasquatch sniffing in one, nor have tracks been followed that lead to a nest. However, the construction of the nests would require hands to manipulate the branches and other components. The only possible candidate for the builders of these nests are Sasquatch or humans. Some eyewitnesses have seen Sasquatch resting but without any sign of a nest. Usually the creatures have been resting on their sides, but on one occasion the creature was lying on its stomach with its knees pulled up. The idea of nests has led to a theory to explain another sign often found in relation to Sasquatch activity: broken saplings and torn branches. It may be that these are signs of anxiety or fear on the part of the Sasquatch. Chimpanzees are known to indulge in this sort of activity when disturbed, though whether it is territorial marking behavior or a display of strength is not clear. In 2007, researchers became aware of another type of structure that might be constructed by Sasquatch. As so often in cryptozoology, the existence of these snow mounds was fairly well known to locals, but they had not been mentioned to outsiders, as none of those who had found them realized their significance. The snow mounds take the form of a mound of snow about 3 or 4 feet high and up to 12 feet across. Once the mound has been gathered together and its surface smoothed over, it is covered by a thick layer of wood chips, bark, branches, and other woody debris. The woody material is usually arranged so that it entirely covers and so insulates the snow. When the snow covering the ground melts away, the snow mound remains intact, taking several days to melt away. However, when snow mounds have been dug into, they have been found to contain nothing but snow. What these structures are for, and even whether they are related to the Sasquatch enigma, is a hotly debated topic. The sites on which the snow mounds have been found have generally been far from human habitations, or, given the deep snows of the high country, human activity at the times they were built. That they contain nothing but snow would seem to rule out the idea that they were constructed to keep some kind of stored food cold. Like so much to do with the Sasquatch, it is a mystery. Some researchers have recorded what they claim are the calls of Sasquatch. These apparent calls come in a wide variety of whoops, whistles, shrieks, growls, and wails. They sound eerie enough when listened to in the comfort of a civilized home or a studio. Out in the woods, they must be utterly disturbing. Some of these recordings have been subjected to a form of analysis that examines the sound wavelengths and internal structures of the call. These have managed to rule out most of the native North American wildlife as the origin of the sounds. They have not ruled out humans as the source of the sound. This might indicate that the calls are hoaxes, or that the creature making them has a vocal system similar to that of humans. Well, that certainly has been interesting, now hasn't it? So what do I think? Oh, there's a lot more to read before I give any opinions. I'm a believer, but yeah, I'm willing to hear both sides of the argument, as long as the skeptics aren't closed-minded and open to accept the possibility of themselves being wrong. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you next time. See ya!